Boston Strangler is a 2023 historical crime drama film written and directed by Matt Ruskin. It is based on the true story of the Boston Strangler, who in the 1960s killed 13 women in Boston. The film stars Keira Knightley as Loretta McLaughlin, the reporter who broke the story for the Boston Record-American. Carrie Coon, Alessandro Nivola, Chris Cooper, David Dastmalchian, and Morgan Spector co-star. Filming took place in the Greater Boston from December 2021 to March 2022. The film was released on March 17th in 2023 by Hulu. The cast includes Keira Knightley as Loretta McLaughlin, an American journalist, author, and newspaper editor. As a journalist for the Boston Record-American, McLaughlin, along with Gene Cole, here played by Carrie Coon, covered the Boston Strangler murders in 1962. She was the first journalist to connect the murders and break the story about the serial killer. In 1992, she was appointed as editorial page editor of the Boston Globe, only the second woman to serve in this role. Alessandro Nivola as Detective Conley, lead detective on the Boston Strangler case. David Dastmalchian as Albert DeSalvo, an American rapist and suspected serial killer in the Boston, Massachusetts, who purportedly confessed to being the Boston Strangler, the murder of 13 women in the Boston area from 1962 to 1964. In 1967, DeSalvo was imprisoned for life for committing the series of rapes. However, his murder confession had been disputed, and debate continues to this day which crimes he actually committed. In July of 2013, DNA was matched between semi-fluid found at the rape of the murder of Mary Sullivan and the DNA obtained from DeSalvo's nephew, linking DeSalvo to the murder of Sullivan and excluding a 99.9% of the remaining population. Authorities exhumed DeSalvo's remains later that month and confirmed the DNA match. Bill Camp as Commissioner Edmund McNamara, an American law enforcement officer and professional football player who served as Commissioner of the Boston Police Department. And Chris Cooper as Jack McLean, the chief editor at the Boston Record-American. Several health procedures had to be followed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The entire crew was vaccinated and tested for the virus 3 times a week until production concluded. Filming wrapped in March of 2022. A house in Belmont, Massachusetts stood in for the home of reporter Loretta McLaughlin. That same day, Winbrook Elementary School was transformed into the Cambridge Police Department for second unit filming. The school was paid $5,000 to be in the film. Although Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, numerous sources have cited he could not possibly have committed all the crimes. These including people who knew him personally, people who had access to all the information on the case, and one of the founders of the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, Robert K. Ressler. Ressler stated it was inconceivable considering the multiple personality traits involved in the crimes and the varying modus operandi. The story this film presents is largely historically accurate, including the details of the crimes and investigation, the names of the victims, the sexism Loretta and Gene faced, and the fact that Loretta and Gene coined the name Boston Strangler. However, authorities, authors, and others still disagree about whether DeSalvo was the sole killer, or whether the murders could have been the work of multiple individuals, as the film suggests. Director Matt Ruskin interviewed the children of Loretta and Gene as well as their former colleagues to learn more about them and their work. In addition, Ruskin read all of Loretta and Gene's articles. He would say, some of the headlines were pulled right from the paper. Keira had some voiceover in the film where you hear what she's actually writing, and some of that was pulled directly from their stories too. Several historical inaccuracies stem from condensing the timeline. For example, in the film, Loretta begins investigating after 3 murders, while in real life she did so after 4. Sophie Clark is murdered on New Year's Eve in the film, but in reality she was discovered on December 5th. In the film, the copycat murders in Michigan occur in 1965, but they really occurred between 1967 and 69, and the film shows DeSalvo's death as occurring shortly after his conviction. In reality, the Boston Strangler's final murder was in 1964. DeSalvo was convicted in 1967, and he was later assassinated in prison in 1973. Other major details changed for the film include the character of Detective Conley, who is a composite of multiple real detectives who worked on the case. The film also shows Loretta and Gene meeting for the first time shortly before working together on the stories in 1962. However, in real life, they worked together as early as April 1952. In the film, DeSalvo calls Loretta and tells her to come visit him during visiting hours the next day to hear his side of the story. However, he's killed by another prisoner that night. In real life, DeSalvo called psychiatrist Dr. Amos Roby just prior to his death. Daniel Marsh is actually a pseudonym given to the suspect in the case, whose identity has never been made public. A suspect also referred to as David Parker by some in the media. In the film and in real life, he was a former Harvard student with a history of domestic abuse who moved to Michigan before the copycat murders took place. However, in the film, the suspect's real name is given as Daniel Marsh, and the film does not mention that another suspect was later convicted of one of the murders in the Michigan case. While the character Paul Dempsey is fictional, some of the details about his life are based on the suspected serial killer, Charles E. Terry. Now, the Boston Strangler case has always been one that fascinated me. If the theories are true, then this was a hugely orchestrated, multi-layered, and downright outrageous aspect of crime organization where multiple men claimed to be the Boston Strangler and committed 13 murders in the mid-1960s. It is true, however, that the modus operandi of each of the crimes was quite different, something unusual for serial killer cases, where most serial killers, of course, leave a calling mark or have a certain style of how they go about their murdering. What makes the Boston Strangler case so complicated, particularly when you look at it from this movie's storyline, is that albeit Albert DeSalvo confessed to the murders, there are lots of conspiracy theories that he was not the only one perpetrating them, and that even famed lawyer F. Lee Bailey, who of course would later work on the O.J. Simpson trial, was involved somehow. Look, there is no further proof of this, and DNA has linked Albert DeSalvo to at least one of the murders. But nonetheless, this film approaches this subject cautiously and in a merited and spirited way. What I liked about this film now is it highlights the hard work from Loretta and Jean in this case, as two female journalists in a very sexist time back in the 60s who are now investigating these horrific murders at the risk of their own very well-being and of course also at the risks of their own marriages and families. Nonetheless, these two women were completely determined to find out the truth, as it were, behind the reality of the Boston Strangler case. Look, this film is nowhere near as gripping as it could have been, but it is an interesting story and a good cast bring it through strongly. For me, Knightley turns out a competent performance here as McLaughlin. She's able to convey her determination and tenacity to succeed at all costs. I do, however, feel that Knightley sort of doesn't evoke enough emotion on Loretta's side, leaving the character somewhat one-dimensional, when the real Loretta McLaughlin was anything but. In many ways, this film is paying tribute to Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole's hard work, but it doesn't quite capture the aspect of how strange, mysterious, and frightening this Boston Strangler case probably was during the mid-60s. What this film, though, does, however, do is cast another spotlight on the game-changing Boston journalism of the time. Now, of course, a film like this is based on real crimes, but you have to compare it to even fictional work like David Fincher's Seven, or, of course, The Zodiac in 2007 based on the real-life murders. And this, by no means, is a crime classic. Yes, the story is interesting, but if you really want to get a full synopsis on the Boston Strangler case, you'd be better to watch Tony Curtis in 1968's Boston Strangler. I feel maybe a stronger director, say a David Fincher for example, would have gone harder on the material and found something deeper in it. Ruskin directs this film well, but I still feels a lot to be desired. He doesn't invoke the fear of this case, how confused everyone must have been, and rather the film sort of plods along at a sort of tempered pace, but never really strikes you and makes you relive the moments. In saying that, though, it's not a bad film. It's well done, it's well constructed, with good competent performances from Knightley and Coon. But even having two actresses that I think are excellent and not really tapping into their abilities maybe just leaves a little bit left on the table for this type of film. It's a fascinating case, and even though it's a very well made film, with competent direction, competent acting, excellent set designs, and attention to detail in so many facets, it's just a film in many ways that doesn't really capture the drama and the horror and fear of these real-life murders by this notorious serial killer. A competent film with competent performances, but does leave a lot on the table. The Boston Strangler gets a 7.5 out of 10.